I invite you to turn your Bibles this morning to the 39th Psalm. The 39th Psalm is going to be our text this morning, and I invite you to be turning there as we'll be reading that in just a moment. First of all, to those who are visiting with us, we thank you for joining us on this occasion as we've come together to worship our great God, to praise His name. And later on this morning, we'll certainly remember the wondrous sacrifice that our God made on our behalf in the death of His Son. But now, as we have opportunity, we look to His Word. We look to His Word to see what He has to say to us, how it is that we should live for Him, and even look to His Word to motivate us, if you will, to greater service and love for Him. The songs that our brother sang for us this morning do fit in with the 39th Psalm, those songs having to do with heaven, songs having to do with the temporary nature of this life. And you look at the 39th Psalm, and we'll just first of all pay attention to what he says beginning in verse 4 of Psalm 39, and we'll go back and look at the rest of the Psalm. But he says, O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my life is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. The temporary nature of life is emphasized in this psalm. But I'll look at it for a few minutes this morning why that is the case. Why is it the psalmist exclaims here beginning in verse 4 about the temporary nature of life and asking God to allow him to know that this is just a shadow? Going back to verse 1 of Psalm 39, we see that there is some turmoil on behalf of the psalmist. He begins in verse 1, David that is, I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with the muzzle so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me as I mused the fire burn. Then I spoke with my tongue. I have used before verse 1 in making a point about how we are to guard our mouth. And certainly the psalmist is saying, I guard my mouth. I am putting a muzzle on my tongue. But why is that? There is some turmoil going on in the life of David. Maybe this is another one of those psalms that fits within the time of Absalom's rebellion, because there is some notes here in the psalm about the wicked prospering. And it may be that is what is on David's mind as he looks at his affliction. This could also fit within the time of Saul's persecution, of course, as well. Here, David following after God and longing for God and loving God, and yet David looks at his life and there's so much turmoil, there's so much lack of peace, there's so much danger. And yet he could look at those who do wicked, and it would seem that the wicked prosper. Perhaps he is thinking even of what Job would lament back in Job chapter 21. This is one of the things which got Job in a little bit of trouble, that while he was still loving God and he was adamant that he was not a sinner, as his friends were saying, and yet Job would lay some accusations at the feet of God and claiming that life is unfair and unjust. And in Job chapter 21, beginning in verse 7, Job states, Why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? Their offspring are established in their presence, and their descendants before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and no rod of God is upon them. Their bull breeds without fail, their cow calves and does not miscarry. They send out their little boys like a flock, and their children dance. They sing to the tambourine and the lyre, rejoice to the sound of the pipe. They spend their days in prosperity, and in peace they go down to Sheol. They say to God, Depart from us. We do not desire the knowledge of your ways. What is the Almighty that we should serve Him? And what profit do we get if we pray to Him? Behold, is not their prosperity in their hand? The counsel of the wicked is far from me. Job here is saying that he looks at the world and it looks like the wicked are always prospering. Now you know in seeing that and reading that Job's not being fair himself. It may look to our eyes oftentimes that, look at the world and everything looks so good. And yet we also know that this is not always true even of the world. The world does not always prosper. Those living in the world do not always rejoice and have prosperity coming their ways. And yet we can become jaded into thinking that. We can become subject to this thinking that Job had, and that it may be that David was dealing with in Psalm 39 as well, that we look at the difficulties of our life. We look at the difficulties of walking as a Christian should, and then we compare with the world and we're thinking, well, why am I doing this? Or maybe better, why is God doing this to me? Why is God oppressing me so much? Why is God making things so difficult? Why does it look like the wicked are always prospering? That was Job's lament. And I think that may be what David was dealing with as well. Now, there's a point here as well. We cannot always control where our mind goes as we're experiencing difficulties and trials. And there may be some questions that come up in our minds. We may begin to wonder, what does David say I'm going to do? I'm going to be quiet. I'm dealing with some things, and there are wicked in my presence. I am not going to open my mouth. The idea would seem to be to accuse God or to charge God falsely or wrongly. I am going to muzzle my mouth. I am going to be silent. Even though he says, I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail. My distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. He is burning on the inside. He is in turmoil on the inside. And yet he says, I'm trying to control my tongue, until finally he says at the end of verse 3, then I spoke with my tongue. But in speaking with his tongue, you'll note what he does not do. He does not lash out against God about how unfair life is. He does not accuse God of hating him and propping up the wicked. Rather, he opens his mouth, and perhaps keeping his cool for a little while has done him some good. Perhaps in reflecting a little bit longer before he opened up his mouth, it did him some good. And now when he opens his mouth, what he opens his mouth to say is, I need understanding. That's the point of verses 4 through 6. O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths. That term isn't necessarily familiar to us, but in Jewish measurement, the handbreadth was the smallest measurement. You would take 4 fingers, you'd put it together, and that would be a handbreadth. You'd measure that, and you could make your marks, a handbreadth. And what does David say? My life is but a few handbreadths. It's short. It's temporary. I need to come to understand this. My lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Of course, the idea is not that man doesn't have a body here on this life, or that man's not real. The idea that life is so fleeting, it seems as if man is just a shadow. He's only here temporarily. He's not going to last. Surely for nothing they're in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. In opening up his mouth, and in this passage seeking understanding, I think David is beginning to grapple with his questions himself, maybe even formulating some answers. If his desire is to understand just how fleeting man's life is, then how would that help him? Well, if man's life is fleeting, then my suffering and my anxiety even in this life, it also is fleeting. It is temporary. It is not eternal. And furthermore, as he clearly makes a point there in verse 6, surely for nothing they are in turmoil. The idea being of those in the world, perhaps the wicked. And yet he begins to realize that they're in turmoil too. And they're looking to gather, and they're looking to prosper, and they're looking to have more and more and more. And so man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. Man's life is temporary. Man's life is short. And so as David is grappling with this, and David is seeking understanding, and he wants to understand just how temporary life is, well then if his life is temporary, that also means the life of those who are wicked is temporary as well. They will not always prosper, even though it seems as if they are prospering in the here and now. Turmoil. But he guards his mouth until ultimately he can open his mouth and therefore seek understanding. And therefore, verse 7 is the keynote of the passage. And now, O Lord, for what do I wait? If life is temporary, if life is fleeting, if David says, I can measure the span of my life in just a few handbreadths, what am I waiting for? What am I seeking to gain Why am I in so much turmoil about how things are going in my life? What am I looking for from this life anyway? Of course, the implied answer would be nothing. What in this life could David hope for? My hope is in you. For what do I wait? My hope is in you. You see, David has dealt with his problems in the correct way. In seeking understanding from God, perhaps God has given him understanding. And the conclusion of it is, here's what I need. As I am in so much turmoil in this life, and I'm in so much anxiety about what is happening and how the wicked are prospering, and yet I see how short man's life is, I have come to the realization yet again, what I need in this life is not what all those in the world are seeking. I need you, God. You're my hope. You're the only thing that I could want. Which then brings David to another realization. If God's what I need, if He's the only real hope that I have, then I need to be living in such a way that I have that hope. Because there's a change when you come to verse 8. Now David is no longer just talking about his own inner anxieties or about how he'd guard his mouth or the fleeting nature of life. Now David's dealing with his iniquities because he's come to this understanding that my hope is in God. And so if my hope is in God, therefore I pray to you, God, deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool. I am mute. I do not open my mouth, for it is you who have done it. Remove your stroke from me. I am spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. Surely all mankind is a mere breath. David looks at this life. He looks at its troubles. And he looks at his sins. And again, this would fit within the time of Absalom's rebellion as David is suffering even for his own misdeeds, his own wrongdoings. And so he recognizes now that since life is short, just a few handbreadths, I am in need of God. And if I'm in need of God, then I'm in need of God's forgiveness. Because I cannot bear God's punishments. If he was experiencing God's punishments now, I cannot bear those. I will waste away, saying basically, turn your gaze away from me. Don't let me feel your stroke anymore. Rather, forgive me. Deliver me from all my transgressions. And it culminates with the final plea. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears. For I am a sojourner with you, a guest like my fathers. Look away from me that I may smile again. Behold, I depart. Before I depart, and I'm no more. Again, David would recognize, even in other Psalms, certainly by prophetic means, that this life is not all there is. But the idea, before I am no more, even looking for God's blessings in this life. What he needs is God's forgiveness. And he prays and he pleads yet again to hear my prayer. The language in verse 12 is significant, and you would recognize it. I am a sojourner with you, a guest, like all my fathers. Israel was to inherit the land that God had promised. But even inheriting that land, you go back into the law. In Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. I'll turn back and read a quick passage. Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, and verse 25. I'm sorry, flip those. Leviticus 25 and verse 23. Where God says, even in the law, the land shall not be sold and perpetuated. Boy, that's one of those words, just sometimes you can't even get it out. Perpetuity, I'll put it that way. Maybe it was right. Okay. The land shall not be sold that way, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. You may remember even when Jacob comes before Pharaoh, and what does Jacob say when Pharaoh asks him about his age? The years of my sojourn are. Well, he had been living in the land of Canaan for a long time, yet he is a sojourner with God. David says, and as he recognizes the temporary nature of this life. that man's life is but a few handbreadths, he recognizes, I am a sojourner with you. I am a guest, like all my fathers. I'm living in this land for only a short time. And I'm not a permanent resident of this land. This is what the Hebrew writer certainly intends to convey to us over in Hebrews, the 11th chapter. In this great hall of faith, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13. The passage may already be coming to your mind in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13, speaking of those of faith like Abraham and Sarah. And he says in verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and grieved them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They were not permanent residents there, even though Abraham lived a ripe, long age. And yet he was just a stranger here on the earth, a temporary dweller, one who was not meant to be here permanently. This is the same exhortation that Peter gives us in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. In 1 Peter chapter 2, if you just flip over a few pages, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. The same language from Psalm 39. You are sojourners and exiles, so abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. You're not here permanently. You're not going to be here forever. Therefore, you shouldn't be living like this world. You are strangers. You are sojourners. You are exiles. And that's what David has recognized in this psalm. I am but a stranger here. I am but a sojourner. My life isn't permanent. And so what he needs, what he hopes for, is God. I can't want anything or wait for anything in this life. I need you. And since I need you, God, forgive me my transgressions. For in this life I am but a stranger and a sojourner. And I need you, even for going to the next. Some application from the psalm that you and I can take. We live in a world that is dominated by evil. And you hear it, and I hear it all the time, that there are those who are struggling with their faith, they're struggling with what it means to be a Christian, and because they look out and this world is so bad, what does this mean for me? Well, I would say there's some practical application from the psalm here. First, hold your tongue. Boy, if we could all just hold our tongue some. Muzzle your mouth. Guard your tongue. David says, I'm going to do that because the wicked are near me. You and I, and God has not promised that we're always going to understand why things are going as they are in this life. We may not. But you and I live in a world that does not love, honor, or fear God. And therefore, their impressions of God are often based on how I handle things. And if the first thing out of my mouth, or shall we say, that goes on the keyboard, so if we're guarding the tongue, muzzling the mouth, maybe we should shackle the fingers. The first thing that comes out is, why is God letting this happen to me? Why is God not happy with me? Why does it look like everyone else is getting ahead and here I am? What am I doing wrong? You may be experiencing that. And I'm not saying that you won't ever experience that. But I think there's some practical advice from David here. Guard your mouth. The wicked are around. Don't compound matters by now sinning against God and accusing God of things that He has not done, by charging God with things that He has not done, and making promises that God never made to you. Guard your mouth. Keep your cool for a while. And the second point of application from David is seek some understanding. Because when David finally opens his mouth, that's what it's for. It's not to rail, it's not to hurl accusations and charges. It is, God, let me understand. And if your goal is understanding, then what you will typically do is you will turn back to God and you'll begin to look at godly principles that may help us to understand. And maybe just the principle that David is dealing with here is all you would ever need to understand. This life isn't everything. That's what David says. That's the understanding that he's reaching for. Help me to understand God, to know my end, the measure of my days, to know how fleeting I am. And so if you and I, in our worst days, when it seems like the world is prospering and Satan is so powerful, if I could just come to that understanding, I am fleeting. My life is temporary. Therefore, again, what I'm going through isn't going to last forever. And those who look like they're prospering so much in this life, they're not always going to prosper either. Because this life is fleeting. And so if we will guard our mouth, muzzle our tongue, shackle the fingers, look for understanding, then we can come to the same conclusion that David did. What was I looking for in this life anyway? Better job? Sure. Many of us would like to have better jobs. More stability in a bad economy? Absolutely. Better health? Yeah. Many of us would like to have better health. But all those are nothing in compared to eternity. All those vanish because life is fleeting. So the ultimate conclusion is the same conclusion that David came to. I wait for nothing. My hope is in you. And what we do then is we move from the external to the internal, because that's what David did in the Psalm. It's no longer what's going on around me, how am I being affected by these external circumstances. Now the matter comes to, if God is my hope, then what is my state with God? What transgressions are standing between me and my God? Am I experiencing even God's punishment in some form in this life? God, remove those from me. Forgive me of my transgressions, for as David says, I am a pilgrim and a sojourner with you. I need you now. This life's only temporary. I'm only a sojourner here. I need you now. I hope for you now. And again, I think even though the way the psalm ends wouldn't indicate that, before I am nothing, but the idea is that since this is temporary, this is short, there is something else. And so if my hope is for God now, then that hope could be satisfied not only now, but in the hereafter. Cody, what's your song of invitation? 323? 322. I think this psalm fits with an invitation. Because if this life will teach us anything, whether it be the tragedies that we hear in the news, or our own personal failings, or the difficult circumstances that some of us may be going through, if it teaches us anything, it should teach us our hope, our only hope is in God. And if our only hope is in God, then we need those sins forgiven. And so we offer an invitation this morning that your hope should be in God. And God gives you that hope. God offers you that hope. Your life is not going to last forever. You don't know the days that you have. Come to an understanding of that. And look to God. And if we can aid you in some way this morning by either helping you to become a part of God's family, by having your sins forgiven through the blood of Christ in baptism, then let us do that. Or whether you even desire the prayers of the saints. Let's stand and sing this song at this time.